Thanks so much for joining me. I'm interested to get your perspective on the war that's happening right now as a military historian. Primarily, in the news, we're getting this kind of really fast play-by-play bits of information. And I think initially I'm just curious how your perspective as a historian and also someone who's served as a colonel in the military, um, how that sort of influences your general perspective on the long view of how this fits into American military history, the ways in which it's a continuation of parts of our history and the ways in which this is a break from it.
Yeah, well, I think in a lot of ways, this is a continuation of themes that are evident in American military history. Americans tend to idealize certain eras and certain conflicts in American history. Most notably, World War II is the quintessential good war, seems to define what the United States stands for or hopes to stand for in the world. The fact of the matter is, World War II is an exception that proves the rule. It's not the kind of war that the United States had ever waged prior or subsequently. And so, in some respects, this is novel terrain for the United States, however, because it is still a global hegemon. Henry Luce famously referred to the period that followed World War II as the American century. So, the United States, through that conflict, established a global world order and purported to be its figurehead. And so, what's interesting at this moment, it's something I don't know that I've seen before, is a time in which the United States is continuing to assert its primacy in world affairs, but seemingly turning its back on that global order that the United States constructed, and there's been a strong bipartisan consensus for generations, has served U.S. interests over that time. So the United States, using military force to muscularly pursue its interests, that's not really new in American history. What is, I think, a little bit different in this case are the circumstances behind it. The lack of any effort to build any kind of consensus within the United States before going to war or consensus among allies either.
Right. And so now, and then zooming back in to the day-to-day ground level of what we're seeing, do you have any, basic predictions or thoughts about where you think it's headed in the next weeks or months?
I'm going to sound optimistic, but I think I'm also being realistic when I predict. Now, I'm a historian, and although I once had a job in uniform as being somebody involved in developing future concepts and kind of predicting what the future operating environments would look like, I am always quick to point out that people that purport to be able to predict the future are usually charlatans of some stripe. So I am not going to make a prediction with any great degree of confidence. However, the United States practiced brinksmanship in this case by threatening Iran with absolute civilizational destruction if it did not agree to some form of ceasefire. The ceasefire that came out of this brinksmanship is one that is not terribly unfavorable to Iran because Iran continues to control the Straits of Hormuz. And because we are now in a 2 week ceasefire and markets responded favorably to this, I don't know that the administration is going to find it politically feasible to turn the rheostat all the way back up, if I may be forgiven for quoting Spinal Tap, to 11. And threatening Iran with absolute civilizational destruction again, when right now there are the prospects, I think, of getting from Iran some version of a deal. Now, the reality is the deal that Iran is going to agree to ultimately is probably going to look a lot like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the Obama administration cemented with Iran and that Trump tore up during his first term in office. So I really don't know what that deal is going to look like, obviously. But in circumstances like this, a sign that if Israel is unhappy with it, Iran is unhappy with it, and the United States is unhappy with it, that's probably a good deal. That's probably the best that you can get out of it. That was the case with the JCPOA, by the way. It's not, however, in the DNA of this particular commander in chief to accept a deal that doesn't feel to him like a win. And so that's the wild card in this instance. I mean, his idea of a deal is one, I think, in which he is clearly a winner. But at the same time, political realities may force him to essentially spin something that is very, very similar to the JCPOA as being radically different, way better, and is going to provide peace in our time and prevent Iran from obtaining a bomb. I would say the 10 different points that have been articulated by Iran, many of those are going to be non-starters for the United States and Israel, and for other parties as well. I don't think there's no actor on the planet outside of Iran that is okay with Iran continuing to control the Strait of Hormuz as though it were a canal, right? Which is essentially what they are trying to assert. So I don't think that's part of any future deal. Iran will retain some right to enrich uranium. Iran may yield the weapons grade uranium that it has, which is part of the American position that they've got to give that up. But ultimately, if there's going to be a deal, almost without doubt, it will be one that Israel does not like, just as Israel did not like the JCPOA.
Do you think that sort of the erratic nature of the threats that the U.S. is making, as well as, like you said, not really attempting to build a consensus of any kind at home before making these kinds of decisions, do you think that that will affect Iran's willingness or willingness to um, accept that the terms of a deal will be upheld, or that that there's any reason to trust what is said publicly going forward?
Interestingly, this is a case in which Iran has a historic opportunity, right? Because it's a very good question, and is a question that I think many people asked when Iran signed the JCPOA. How can they have any faith that the United States is going to abide by this deal, knowing that so many Iran hawks in the United States and in Israel were so dead set against it, and then you had the opposition party campaigning on pledges to tear it up. In this instance, as they said that only Nixon could go to China, only Trump can cement a deal with Iran that will produce a JCPOA 2.0 that all parties think are going to stick afterward, right? Who future Democratic presidential candidates are not going to campaign on a pledge to tear up a peace agreement between the United States, Israel, and Iran. So if this administration can get a deal out of this that Iran is willing to enter into, I think Iranians can have reasonable confidence that the United States is going to abide by that deal because the Trump administration's position is going to be the maximalist position that they would anticipate, coming out of the American political spectrum. Another thing that's interesting, I think, about this current conflict, and I'm thinking of Thomas Schelling's strategy of conflict, and the way that two sides engage in this kind of contest of wills. Is this was with the ultimatum that the Trump administration, that President Trump himself had put on Iran, in essence, a game of chicken in which President Trump threw the steering wheel out the window. Like there was it's about as far as you can go is what President Trump said the United States was going to do if Iran did not agree to a ceasefire. And what's interesting about that is generally it is the weaker part in a game of chicken. It's the party that has nothing to lose or everything to lose that will throw the steering wheel out the window. In this instance, it's I think noteworthy that it was the United States that took that position. And I think that that says something, about this particular president's instincts. There have been presidents in the past. Nixon again comes to mind, with negotiations with North Vietnam, where he wanted to play up his reputation as a arch anti-communist mad bomber, the madman theory. Hanoi has no idea what I'm capable of, and sowing in communist Vietnamese minds this idea that this guy's crazy. He'll do just about anything. I don't know that Nixon would have done just about anything, but President Trump, I think you used the word erratic a moment ago. That element of it, I think, actually in this instance, help contribute to an Iran willingness to enter into a ceasefire, which is not to say, that this is, some genius act of statecraft. But as a historian, as I'm observing these things in real time, these are the kinds of reflections that I've had on it. But I also want to reiterate the point that notwithstanding Iran's willingness to enter into the ceasefire, um, it does also signify a degree of American weakness. Okay. And what I'm referring to here specifically is the fact that the United States did not open the Strait of Hormuz by force, which is not to say that the United States could not open the Strait of Hormuz by force, but rather at the very least that the United States must have calculated that the risks associated with attempting to do so were unacceptably high, right? Otherwise, I don't know that we would have entered into a 2-week ceasefire with de facto Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, which is its greatest leverage at present.
I have a question that I'd like to come to in a little bit about more about communication style and like you were touching on Nixon and the comparisons, but you brought up the Strait of Hormuz, and one thing that I've read about is how in a lot of war games, gaming out this a scenario of conflict with Iran, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz was one of the first things that would come up repeatedly, and yet it seems to have sort of caught this administration off guard. I'm curious how you understand, the sequence of decision making in light of information like that.
Two things I would say in answer to that question. First is it seems clear to me that President Trump was receiving positive reinforcement from a pattern of more aggressive action dating back to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and then in his second administration last summer's Operation Midnight Hammer, the counter narco campaign in the Caribbean, the Maduro operation, most specifically, which the president continues to reference. Essentially, he just continued to receive positive reinforcement. And I can say that prior to the assassination of Soleimani, I think that this president, in his first term, was a little more circumspect. I think he took more seriously the solemn, sometimes pessimistic counsel of his principal military advisors, who have a responsibility to lay out the potential risks and rewards and to offer their recommendations on whether or not they would, do something. They tell the president what they think they can do, what they cannot do, and what the likely consequences and risks of those are likely to be. From Soleimani through Maduro, the president was receiving nothing but but positive feedback, right? So the senior military advisors giving him assessments of the risks associated with this, what could go wrong. They look like so many naysayers potentially to the president in retrospect. The problem this time around is this is not the assassination of an individual. This is not a limited bombing campaign against a set of targets. This is not, and I don't want to diminish the call it the virtuosity of the Joint Special Operations raid that captured Maduro, which was a stunning military success, but it was nevertheless on a very, very surgical kind of scale. What the administration, the United States, is trying to do right now in Iran is a different beast altogether. And I'm confident, right? I have no inside information, as it were, but I am confident. I'm absolutely confident that the administration, that the president was advised of likely consequences of what was going to happen. But I think he was conditioned by a pattern of success into ignoring. I don't want to say ignoring, but minimizing those statements of risk. Of course, it broke to the media, evidently, that Chairman Dan Kane had advised the president, that all kinds of bad things might happen if we do this. And the president responded, "This is fake news." Like, General Kane has no doubt he's 100% with me. We're going to win, and we're going to win quickly. I think that there are certainly truth. I would imagine that initial news report about the chairman offering, as it is his duty to do, the less optimistic elements of what might come out of this. I suspect that reporting is true. The second thing that I would say is Duke political scientist Peter Feaver, who has been an advisor to administrations in the past, is one of the deans of civil military relations in the United States, has often said that elected officials have a right to be wrong. And military leaders do not have the right to not obey orders that they think are imprudent or misguided. So we'll see where all of this ends ultimately. And whether or not, as a historian, I think it's too early to conclude that the Trump administration exercised its right under the Constitution to be wrong. But I do think its willingness to do something that no other administration prior, I think, even came close to contemplating doing, despite the fact that the recommendations, the acknowledgement of the risks by senior military leaders, probably been fairly uniform over the past. One last thing I'll chase that point with, though, is circumstances have changed. Circumstances have changed dramatically going back to the assassination of Soleimani. So I will say of the Iranians have always, notwithstanding the fact that they have been nefarious actors in the region and in the world, but they have operated with tremendous restraint in the past because their sole interest, their paramount interest, always is to remain in power. The revolutionary regime in Iran, their interest is to stay in power, and so they've often been very, very restrained in the ways in which they have responded to provocations by the United States, especially under the Trump administration, and that just looked like prudence on their part. What the Trump administration has also learned, though, in the past year, and I would go back even further, okay, we'll go back to the events of October 7th and Iran's offensive then into Gaza and its operations against both Hamas and Hezbollah. They have dramatically reduced the fearsomeness of Iran's so-called axis of resistance. And then what Operation Midnight Hammer last summer revealed was that Iran's control of its own airspace was not as formidable as perhaps everybody had assumed. And so the uh, evident weakness of Iran across, the entire spectrum of the space in which it has competed with the United States and Israel, the putative gray zone, it's lost standing, it's lost capability, it's lost capacity across all of that. And the scale of the attacks that it's been able to launch, just prior to the ceasefire, suggests, while it is not absolutely impotent, or was not just before the ceasefire, it nevertheless has limited capacity to respond. And so all of these things, I think, were further encouragements to the Trump administration to see how far they could go. They had no interest in building consensus at home because there would be no consensus at home. I think it would probably have been a fool's errand to try to build a consensus case to do this, as the George W. Bush administration had done for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And so, encouraged and emboldened by the Maduro model, I think the president just assumed, we'll get a quick win. Everybody said it couldn't be done, and we'll do it. And notwithstanding the fact that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is saying that this is a victory with a capital V, um, at this point, it's way too early to conclude that is the case. And I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. If it does ultimately produce a victory with a capital V, that victory will look a lot, I suspect, like the JICPOA that this administration, well, the previous Trump administration, deliberately discarded.
Right. You mentioned earlier you spoke about Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, General Dan Kane. Um, if I'm correct, you were a historian for the Joint Chiefs of Staff for some time. I'm curious, as a historian, uh, what your perspective on General Dan Kane is and how he's sort of been handling the situation.
Yeah, but by all accounts, General Kane is a outstanding chairman and maybe the right, perfect, the indispensable man at this moment. I know, many Americans are rightly concerned about, these operations against Iran for a number of reasons. And so as I praise General Kane, I just want to acknowledge that I know there are some out there that would hope you would have a chairman who would, resign in protest, who, throw down his commission and say, Mr. President, I can't do that. That's not the way civil military relations in this country work. That's not the way that they are supposed to work. And so back to the Peter Fever line about administrations having the right to be wrong. As far as the military is concerned, these are lawful orders that are being delivered by the president and the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Force has a legal obligation to carry them out. The question of jus ad bellum, and whether or not there's a just cause for war, is one that sort of that exists outside of military channels. The question of jus in bello, your conduct in war, is very much a concern, for inside of the military. So I will say all of that, but I will say that General Kane has the president's trust while not himself being a partisan figure. He is, as the American profession of arms is supposed to be, an apolitical, nonpartisan professional. Where civil military relations in the country become fraught and problematic is when elected leaders do not trust their senior generals and admirals, because they suspect that the senior generals and admirals have political loyalties that are out of line with the administration. And that, I think, uh, I should point out, under this administration remains a concern for many people. That within this administration, the idea of apolitical neutrality is itself suspect. That many media outlets report that the administration, would favor leaders who seem more aligned with the administration's priorities and values. It's not the job of the professional military to align with any administration's priorities. It is their duty to carry out the orders that they are given, the legal orders that they are given. And so the fact that General Kane is able to remain, I would say, from what I've observed, a paragon of healthy civil military relations, apolitical, nonpartisan, and retain the trust of this administration is uh, as much of a silver lining, I suppose, that I can detect from these recent operations.
You mentioned carrying out lawful orders. You have people like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are calling on military leaders to refuse illegal orders. Is that something that you see happening, or yeah? What are your thoughts on that?
So thus far in the campaign against Iran, as I said, I haven't detected any orders, following along as everyone else does with what's available in public media. I haven't seen any orders that I think warrant willful disobedience of. I do think that the president's threats to obliterate Iranian civilization as we know it, this is one of the risks. When I said that this is a maximalist approach, I likened it to the game of chicken in which one of the competitors throws the steering wheel out the window. You cannot go much further than that. One of the risks I think associated, well, there are multiple risks, right, associated with making that kind of absolutist threat. But one of them may be that up and down the chain of command, you may at last incur resistance inside the system, right, where there are judge advocates general who are opining to their commanders, right, that to their principals, ma'am, sir, that strike is almost certainly a violation of the law of armed conflict, and I recommend that you do not approve that target set. That could have occasioned something of a crisis, right, for the administration and in civil military relations. Um, Whether or not that would have happened, I don't actually I don't actually know. But those representatives, and I think the the senators and congressmen that the Secretary of Defense called the seditious six, or however many there were, Mark Kelly being the most prominent of them because he is a retired naval officer with the rank of full captain, being sort of the figurehead for that group because of the Pentagon's efforts to punish him and potentially reduce him in rank after his retirement. Certainly, there's an element of political theater associated with elected officials encouraging members of the military to disobey or not obey illegal or unlawful orders. But Mark Kelly and others of that group are absolutely right to say that they are not saying anything that recurring annual training on the law of armed conflict does not promulgate to every uniformed member of the armed forces. Anyways, it's all about the circumstances, and of course, it's all about the politics as well. So the U.S. military trains its people to disobey illegal orders. The problem in conflicts such as this is so much of it is in the eye of the beholder, and you can find lawyers that can give you whatever answer you are looking for the further up the chain of command you go. And I don't mean that, as a professional affront or suggesting that, any particular legal opinions, I have no idea, have been unethical or violations of the ethics of that profession. It's just there's are cut and dry cases of violations of the law of armed conflict, executing prisoners, for instance, whereas decisions to strike electrical plants, you can make an argument, right, that those electrical plants contribute to Iran's ability to continue to prosecute the war effort and are therefore legitimate military targets. There is a grayness to decisions like that. And then, as a military historian, I will also point out there is ample precedent in the past of in the United States is party to this, right? I pointed out before that the Second World War is in American memory the quintessential good war. One of the ironies of that fact is it's also the war in which the United States lowered the threshold of what it considered to be the legitimate use of force in just about every conceivable fashion. And so historically, great powers have imposed blockades, which cause incredible civilian suffering, famines for civilian populations. The very doctrine of strategic bombing, as originally articulated in the 1920s and I will say refined in air quotes during World War II, depended upon the incineration or razing of residential housing areas of enemy combatants, deliberately targeting civilian populations and killing them by the tens of thousands because they contribute to the enemy war effort. Don't mistake me. I'm not justifying, the Trump administration's threats to end Iranian civilization. But as a military historian, there is ample historical precedent for great powers launching strikes against the kinds of targets that the Trump administration was proposing to hit this time around. In the Korean War, the United States could not get the Koreans to come to a settlement and was reduced to deliberately bombing dams in North Korea that would flood the countryside and the net effect of this campaign of bombing dams was to increase civilian suffering and privation. So the United States has used force at tremendous scale, not only into this gray area, but into the darker stretches of this gray area in the past.
So we've been talking about, talking about Trump's recent threat on Iran's infrastructure and on the entirety of Iran. Um, this I kind of want to circle back to when we were talking about Nixon and about these sort of madman styles of communication, public communication. I sort of want to dive a little deeper on that and just get your sense of how public communication is being used in this war and how it sort of compares to ways in which public communication has been used in the past by other presidents or military leaders.
Yeah, I mean, this is a subject I think that people are going to be able to write theses and dissertations and perhaps books on in the future. So there are a lot of things that are unique about this particular administration and its public relations and its media campaign. Not least of which is the administration's generation of memes, other sorts of videos that are likening, the war to a video game. Wii Sports montage with precision guided munitions blowing up targets, etc. That's one element of it. Another element of it, and this is not unique to the Pentagon spokespeople or this Secretary of Defense. It's kind of the rule across the administration. Are press secretaries who are very combative and polemical in their presentation of information. So it's the most partisan, polemical, hyperbolic kind of public relations campaign that I can that of which I am familiar in any war in American history, because the rule in the past has been to at least try to produce the sense that the whole nation is at war, even if the whole nation is not at war. And hence, there's an imperative, or at least a highly desirable motive, to build consensus, to get buy-in from, all elements of American society. And this is being largely waged as a war that, the administration is expecting, its loyal supporters to be 100% on board, and is not only not interested in winning over skeptics or independent, undecided people in the population, but alienating them, insinuating that, and any question that any journalist throughout history might have asked under similar circumstances, that there's something improper, wrong, unpatriotic about even posing the question. So I do think that this is uncharted territory for the United States, but not territory that anybody should be surprised about, again, given the general public relations posture and playbook of this administration.
You mentioned in a previous interview that I read, which is about a month ago, that you didn't expect there to be any boots on the ground occupation of Iran anytime soon. Is that do you still feel that way?
I absolutely feel that way about an occupation. I continue to think that that is incredibly unlikely. I Well, the president has shifted over his two terms in his willingness to assume risk and to proactively and provocatively use armed force. There are certain things that I think remain kind of bedrock fundamentals for him, and one of them is not to get sucked into a quagmire forever war sort of scenario. I do know that the president has allies in Congress who have recently suggested, we need to do whatever it takes. We can't go home. We need to topple this regime, and it'll be easy. We'll just send troops in, and how anybody can say that with any sort of conviction or a straight face is honestly stunning to me under the circumstances. I'm not to say, again, I'm not a futurist anymore, and when I was, I still disclaim my ability to predict the future. I'm not saying I think it is highly, highly unlikely that the United States will do that, because in the assessment of risk and likely outcome, the idea that the regime will just collapse and that the Iranian people will rise up and welcome the United States as liberators and assume control of their own company, I think that that is a fantastical possibility. It's not an impossibility, but I think it is highly, highly unlikely. And so I remain convinced that this president does not want the United States to get committed to another resource, manpower intensive, casualty intensive, capital intensive campaign to install a friendly government in a foreign land, especially one as vast as Iran, where even the Iranians who have very negative views of their current leadership also have long and not particularly sanguinary memories about the United States' role in Iran's history. So I do stand by that prediction for what it is worth. What I would offer as you know a little bit of an addendum to that prediction, however, I would not rule out the use of infantry forces, ground combat forces, to conduct some sort of raid or to seize some piece of terrain, some critical node, with the idea of using it for diplomatic leverage, and then potentially returning it or not after the war. So I know that General Frank McKenzie was a guest on Face the Nation fairly recently and had mentioned the prospect of a raid to seize Karg Island. And when the 1st Brigade Combat Team of the 82nd Airborne Division received deployment orders, speculation was rampant about how, where the United States would use, a brigade of paratroopers in this theater of operations, and Karg Island was one of the targets that was mentioned. I think that is an incredibly risky operation. Right now, obviously, it would also violate the ceasefire, which seems very tenuous in the first place. But should the ceasefire not hold, should it not yield, an extension and eventually some kind of peace agreement, I do think the United States, I'm confident the United States is planning for the introduction of ground combat troops. That brigade combat team of the 82nd Airborne Division, is not, simply playing Game Boy while they're told what to do. I mean, it's in the nature of military organizations to plan for multiple contingencies. But I do think that committing them in even that limited capacity is a very high risk operation. And so I would hope and suspect that the administration would not take lightly a decision to commit them to seizing a target like that.
Another big consideration that people are thinking about and talking about is are the various financial interests involved in all of this. And I mean, even thinking about the idea of corruption, uh, you have Jared Kushner's business interests in the Middle East and his role in facilitating negotiations. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on that and also the history of the relationship between U.S. military conflict and corruption among leaders that are involved in that.
Yeah, I don't feel as a military historian. I don't know that I have any particular scholarly expertise to lend to that question. I will say, historians are going to certainly be very interested in that question in the future. And I think, members of Congress, the American public are interested in that question right now. I'll leave it to journalists, investigative journalists start to write the first draft of history on that, and then potentially to members of Congress to use that first draft of history to investigate this further. In the past, I would say that it has long been the suspicion of Americans that the United States, wages war to benefit, Wall Street. That this was a particular fear, and I would say beyond fear, probably an article of faith amongst Americans during the first America First movement or era, which was in the 1930s, the era of American history in which isolationism was arguably at its strongest in all of American history. A product at the time of buyer's remorse over the First World War, a lack of faith in government because of the Great Depression, a lack of faith in Wall Street and American elites because of that. And the famous Marine Corps General Smedley Butler wrote his famous or infamous pamphlet "War is a Racket," in which he argued as one of the senior most and most famous leaders of the Marine Corps at the time, and in all of U.S. Marine Corps history at that point in time, that he had been a thug, a muscle man, a gangster for capitalism, and that most Marine interventions in the Pacific Rim and in Latin America, going back into the late 19th centuries, had all been to benefit American commercial interests. That's different, however, than corruption, right? I mean, and Smedley Butler at that time, I think, he had a very, very receptive audience to these arguments, and many Americans at the time, I mentioned this buyer's remorse over World War One, suspected that bankers and armaments manufacturers, the so-called merchants of death, had sort of hoodwinked Americans into entering a war that was not part of America's real intimate concerns. And that is, I think, kind of a recurring motif in American history, at least since the post-Civil War era. Um, my specialty is the pre-Civil War era, but I will not bore you with what I think is a very different story that I would tell in that particular era. Um, but what I'm referring to there is, I think, also kind of an article of faith of scholars who work on American empire. That in so many instances, the exercise of American power abroad, whether it's in war or using the other instruments of national power, ultimately is serving, the interests of Wall Street. That's not necessarily inappropriate, but it is also, I think, galling to many Americans, particularly if they do not see that the war is in the intimate interests of the United States, right? No one wants to lay their child on the altar of quarterly earnings reports. Like freedom, liberty, the defense of the homeland, Americans will send their sons and daughters to die for that. They're deeply resentful of the idea that they are dying for the bottom line, for the S&P 500, and certainly for the private interests of individuals who are connected to a government.
Right. I want to return to one final thing you mentioned in the interview that you gave back in March, which is you talked about the possibility of Iran pursuing the full range of its possible military responses against the United States. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, as the United States and Israel, Israel has long used assassination as one of its instruments of statecraft. So a moment ago, I referred to them, and within the U.S. military, traditionally, those have been expressed as diplomacy, informational, military, and economic. Other people have added financial and legal to these instruments of national power. But the Israel has used covert operations and targeted assassinations since its founding, in particular in its war against Iran. The United States has not really participated, certainly not at the extent that Israel has, but I earlier described Qasem Soleimani's killing as an assassination, and I think that that's a fair characterization of it, a fair use of that word. Um, Iran reserves the what it perceives as its right of responding in kind, and so um, whether or not it is in Iran's interests to do that is a critical question. Whether or not it actually has a capability of doing that is another question. But let us say that they have the capability, and that they, felt that they had been backed into a corner and they had to, use every instrument in their arsenal. That's one that I think that you could possibly envision them trying to do. trying to broaden the scope of their operations and where they are conducting attacks. As I said before, I actually think that Iran has, as long as I have been, involved with, military planning vis-a-vis Iran, for the last 6 years or so, that Iran has been incredibly restrained. I won't say, let me retract the word incredibly. They have been notably restrained in their responses and provocations. The reason it's not incredible is if you recognize that their single driving imperative is to remain in power. And I think that they recognize that if they cross a certain line, that they may invite the kind of response in which they're going to lose control of the situation. So an example of that, I predicted, with reasonable confidence a while ago, we will not send in large ground formations to topple the regime, occupy and rebuild Iran. All bets are off if Iran assassinates, a senior American or Israeli, military or political figure. All bets are off if Iranian proxies conduct a devastating high-profile terrorist attack. So I think that these are contingencies that the Iranians have likely planned for. Um, right at this moment in particular, where you have a 2 week ceasefire while they continue to control the Strait of Hormuz, and where I think the Trump administration has a very, very strong, I wouldn't call it an imperative, but the Trump administration is under probably really, really powerful pressures to actually get some kind of deal out of this rather than going back to open war. I think Iran will, continue to abide by its MO of this last decade and more of holding some cards close to its vest, never to play them.
Finally, my final question is just, do you have any advice or yeah, sort of advice or wisdom for people as we continue to watch what happens and follow the news, things to consider that maybe aren't obvious from the ways in which things are getting reported?
No, the one thing I think that concerns me, and I gave an interview to each of the student newspapers at UW. I can't remember which one this one was most recently, though. The concluding question was a similar one, and I suggested that the last thing that Americans should do is conclude that this is not their war. They didn't support it. They're not fighting in it. They don't know anybody that's fighting in it. Que sera, sera. I'll oppose it or I'll support it, based upon my, political leanings, but I'm not going to really pay attention to this, or I'm only going to get my news about this war from my social media feed, which of course is based upon algorithms that will convince you that the things that you are already thinking are the things that you ought to think. That people should break out of that loop, and actually pay attention to this conflict. Be educated about it, be concerned about the conflict, to get news on it from the most reliable sources, which is also a point that I've made to a student relatively recently, is a source being critical is not the same thing as a source being biased or partisan. And so the best reliable sources to educate oneself on this conflict are all inherently critical sources, because that's what real journalists, as you know, do. That's part of the professional obligation of doing that. So I think that there are some questions that Americans will want to ask about this conflict, that they should be asking right now. And then, however this ends, and let us hope in a settlement that everybody is mildly unhappy with, which means it's probably built on the foundation of the best possible settlement that has a decent chance for enduring success. Once the dust settles, I think there are other questions that Americans will need to ask and want to ask about this, in particular about war making authorities. So Democrats in Congress have proposed unsuccessfully a number of bills trying to rein in the administration, which had launched this elective war without the consent of the body that the Constitution gives the authority for war making. As a historian, I will say that here again there is tremendous gray area, right? That the Constitution does not bind any commander in chief's hands to not use military force unless she or he has the permission of Congress. That there are operations below a particular threshold in which administrations need to have the latitude to do that. My hot take, as it were, as a historian, not generally in the business of offering hot takes, is that this rises above that threshold, right, of what administrations uh, generally uh, ought to be able to do without some kind of endorsement from Congress. So as a historian, that's the set of questions that I'm going to be most interested in looking at in the aftermath of this conflict, which hopefully is just around the corner.
Thanks so much, John, for talking with me, for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it.
Yep, my pleasure. Take care, Marco.
You too. Bye bye.